Good morning. Grace, mercy, and peace be from God as we meditate on His Word, and may this meditation be pleasing to Him. Amen? One of the great things about being the guest preacher is I can pretty much say whatever I want, and then Mark and Anthony have to deal with the fallout. So they can be like, I can challenge you all day, and I don't have to, you don't pay my salary, so I can just joking a little bit, but they gave me a tough one. And ironically, Anthony, as I was doing research on this, he said you're closing out our series on parables. And then I start reading the commentaries and start reading the notes and start reading the history of this story. And there's debate on whether this is even a parable or not. Some people say this is actually Jesus describing an event that really happened. And one of the reasons that people say that is because it's very unusual for Jesus to name someone in a parable. Yet in this parable, someone gets a name. Lazarus, the poor man, as we're going to see here in a second. So, and I think there's a reason for that. And I tend to think this is a parable, and even if it's not a parable, it's still a great story, and it's still a story that challenges us, and I'm no doubt it challenges Jesus' disciples and the people that heard this story when they first read it, because it really forces us to wrestle with this question, rich and poor. What does it mean to be rich? What does it mean to be poor? And then why in this story particularly, whether it's a parable or not, why is the rich person receive one, consequence or one situation in the end, and why does the poor person receive the other? And what does that have to do with faith? Because as Lutherans, it's really important for us that we keep emphasizing that we are saved, we are justified. Our standing before God has to do with faith alone, not by our works. And yet this is one of those parables that kind of challenges that idea. It leans a little bit towards James. It's like faith without works is dead. And the idea that there's something going on here that seems to indicate that what destiny, eternal destiny in the case of these two guys in this story, is a little bit tied to things on earth that seem to be on faith. So let's unpack that for a second. First, I want to read the story. If you have a Bible, if you're looking along, or if it's up on the screen, it's from Luke chapter 16, verse 19. It's called The Rich Man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried up by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. He cried out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the ends of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish by this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in manner bad things. And now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you must not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, "Thus I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, and may he warn them, lest they come to this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And he said to him, "If they will not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." That's the gospel of the Lord. Now, I know you guys have kind of started a new thing with some of the messages here, so I'm going to start with a question, and I'm going to ask you to kind of circle around with those around you, kind of in an immediate group there, and answer this question. Take about a couple of minutes just to reflect on this. How do you define being rich and being poor? Just take a couple of minutes and just circle around and say hi to a neighbor and answer that question. How do you define being rich? How do you define being poor? Don't be shy. All right, let me ask you guys a question as you're thinking about that. How many of you feel that, and you can raise your hand, this is participatory, how many of you feel that you've seen real wealth in your life? You've been in the house of a wealthy person, you've been in a place, in a store that sells items, you're like, there's no way I could ever afford that, you know? So, yeah, it's intimidating, right, to be around real wealth, to be around people that really have, you know, like the way this guy lives, you know? Purple, fine linens, feasted daily, seems to have no troubles in the world. You know, they have servants, their servants have servants. They're so wealthy. And then let me ask the other question then. How many of you have seen real poverty? Like we saw in that video. How many of you have been to a third world country and seen real poverty? I think for me, the first time I went to Uganda, and I've been involved with some, and I know Water's Edge has historically too, with supporting the Lutheran Church in Uganda. And first time I went there, I went to the church in the village that we were supporting, and I still support a couple of the pastors there. And in the middle of the church service, they did the offering, and people literally brought fruit and eggs up for the offering. Because they don't even operate in a money system in that village. If you ever see money, it's a true barter system. And I was like, now that's poverty. And yet they were running up there and doing it with a great smile on their face. So one of the things we'll see from this text and from our message today is that does wealth equal happiness? And does poverty or being poor equal misery? And the answer, sadly, is not. If you've been in a third world country, you'll see that a lot of the poorest people in the world are some of the happiest, and some of the wealthiest people in the world are some of the most miserable. So it definitely doesn't make you any happier. And we'll unpack that here in a minute, too. So at first, then, next slide, please. At first, today's parable seems to simply be about a rich man and a poor man. It seems to be a pretty simple story about a rich man who lived one way, a poor man who lived another way, and this rich man, this poor man were connected, and that the poor man was a beggar probably, you kind of envision this in a modern sense, would be sitting at the guy's estate, you know, and there would be a security to get in, or you'd have to get a code in. So he never actually got inside, but kind of sitting at the gate or sitting at the outside of this guy's lavish house, and that's where he was allowed to beg. So that you have this poor man who's begging literally at the foot of this rich man, and it seems to be a story about these two guys and what happens to them when they die. And what, you know, and so a simple reading of this is rich guy mistreats poor guy, or kind of ignores poor guy on earth, and he ends up in hell in punishment. Poor guy has a rough life on earth, ends up in heaven, and there we go. So here's an image of that. This is a famous painting of this story, and you see the lavish guy, you know, with his servants. You see the poor guy, you know, outside the house, you know, with sores, you know, begging, just hoping to get the crumbs from the table. And it's interesting because, and we're going to look at this in a second in more depth, but this is a second time in which this phrase, crumbs from the table, shows up in scriptures. The other time is when Jesus leaves Israel and leaves Judea and leaves Galilee and goes into a non-Jewish area, And this woman comes and asks him to heal his daughter. And he says this which seems really offensive, why would I take from the people and give it to the dogs? And she says, well, even the dogs want the crumbs from the table. Like just saying, we'll take your leftovers, Jesus. But the same thing here, this guy's wanting the crumbs. This guy's like, I could live with your leftovers. I'd be fine with that. Hoping that, that maybe the image is as the rich man's, servants are taking the food out to throw it away, maybe they'll say, hey, here, you want the leftovers from dinner kind of deal. That's kind of the image we have here. He's just sitting there hoping that whatever's left over from this wealthy guy, he'll get. So we see the rich man with all the lavish, purple, fine linens, and we know in Jesus' time, purple was the most expensive dye. So if you had purple, that was a sign of royalty. Fine linens, feasted daily. It's like every day he had the most famous chef, come cook his dinner or whatever. He had not a worry in the world. And then we see the poor man, who's got sores all over his body, no access to health care, crumbs from the table, and his only comfort comes from dogs who come and lick his wounds. So there's a really harsh contrast between wealth and poverty in this story. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That's a simple reading of this story. And parables, or even the teachings of Jesus, if this is not a parable, let's go with the assumption that it is, never have a simple reading, never have a simple story. Even when Jesus, when they ask him, the disciples, why do you teach in parables? He basically says to confuse people. Well, thanks, that's helpful. But no, and he says, for those that are paying attention, there's a deeper meaning there, and they'll get it. But for those who just read it surfacely, they're going to kind of be left a little confused. So the whole point then of a parable is he's training his disciples. He's this 3 year of intense training to take over and literally take his message to the ends of the world. But so he's making them think. He's making them unpack. He's making them process. What is the deeper meaning here? What is Jesus trying to get across to us? So with that in mind, then this is a much deeper meaning than a simple story about a rich man and a poor man, about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. So there's a deeper lesson here. This is not just about heaven and hell. This is not just about rich and poor, but Jesus is really trying to delve into something deeper. And 2,000 years later, we read this same story and we're like, okay, what's Jesus trying to tell us here? What is this message really about? Next slide, please. First thing that I believe that Jesus is trying to tell us in this story is you see the heaven and the hell look at who's that? Who do you think that is an image of on the right? The one holding the child. Yeah, he's at Abraham's bosom and he's showing, and it's interesting, he's not just showing the one, it's showing others and kind of this place of comfort and this place of the guy who's poor on earth gets comforted in the afterlife. It's kind of what's kind of going on here. And it's this idea of, that something good is going to come out of this. Go on to the next slide. First, this parable is about understanding Jesus' concern for both the rich and the poor, but especially the poor. But we tend to think that Jesus only cared about the poor, but no, the people who financially supported Jesus, Mary and Martha and Lazarus and others, were people of wealth. And we see that in the early church too, that the people that supported Paul, the people that supported the early apostles were people of wealth who gave generously so that those that had the gift to bring good news to the world were funded. And that's been the pattern of the church ever since, is that there are, even in most churches, there's usually a handful of people that do the majority of the financial support of that church, of that ministry. So Jesus does show concern for the wealth. And he shows concern for the wealth by kind of challenging them, by saying, hey, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for you to go to heaven. He's not saying you can't go to heaven, but he's saying that wealthy people have the biggest challenge sometimes in accepting grace, accepting good news, accepting a gift, believing they can't do it themselves. But Jesus does not reject the support of wealthy people. He shows concern for all. But let's talk about what does Jesus say about the poor throughout the scriptures. One of the things he says, I call it Jesus' drop the mic moment, when he goes back to his hometown and they're reading the scroll of Isaiah. And in that scroll it says, bring good news to the poor, set the captives free. And then he says, oh, by the way, this prophecy is being fulfilled in your moment right before you. Like, I'm the fulfillment of that. And he does that in his hometown, and they're like, oh, yay, Jesus. No, they try to run him out of town. They're like, no way. They get mad. But the point is that Jesus is saying is that I've come to give good news, particularly to the poor. He talks about blessed are the poor in spirit. He says things like, whatever you did for the least of the people, the ones that were hungry, the ones that were thirsty, the ones that were in prison, the ones that had not enough, he says, you did it for me. So all of that to say is, Jesus identifies mostly with the poor. He even says, the rich have all these other people have places to go, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his hand. God chose to come into the world poor and to live amongst the poor. And the majority of his healings and his miracles and the majority of his serving is towards the poor. And he challenges the rich. But his challenging of the rich is not because he doesn't love them. He says things like, too much is given, what? Much is expected. So the whole point is it's not bad being wealthy. And by the way, I want you to realize that if you're in this room, you're probably wealthy compared to the world. I mean, if you make more than $100 a week, you're like in the richest 5% of humanity. So we're all, including myself, wealthy. If we all should identify with the rich man in this story, not the poor man, because compared to the rest of the world, we are all wealthy, and God has given us so much more than we deserve, and we are abundantly blessed. So when we hear that story, when we hear what Jesus say, too much is given, much is expected, we shouldn't be thinking about, well, Bill Gates should give more. No, we should be like, I should give more. Because in the eyes of the world, I am beyond wealthy. I'm beyond blessed. And that's a challenge for us. But so the point, though, is, and another thing that Jesus says, and I want to end on in this point for this part, is he says, the poor will always be with you. When the lady comes to anoint him and with the really expensive perfume and wash his feet, and Judas challenges her and says that could be sold. That what a waste of this expensive perfume. It could have been sold. That money could have been given to the poor. And you would think that Jesus, with his heart for the poor, would say, you're right. But what does he say? No, he says, the poor will always be with you. But what she did is amazing. And it's what Pastor Anthony talked about. It's shown abundance. But what does that mean, that the poor will always be among us? That's a challenge, right? Because Jesus doesn't say, my kingdom is going to resolve poverty here on earth. Now, in the new kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth, at the resurrection, we see no poverty. But until he returns, he's telling us that the poor will always be with us. So let's take a look at the next slide. It's about our attitude towards being rich and towards being poor. Well, I said before, do you see yourself as rich, or do you see yourself as poor? Do you see yourself as having enough, or do you see yourself always needing more? It's interesting that one of the things that Jesus does in this parable to give dignity to the poor over the rich is, who does he name in the story? Does he name the rich man or does he name the poor man? Who does he give a name to? Who's the rich man? What's the name of the rich man in this story? We don't know. Now, how opposite of that is the world we live in, right? And I'm sure it was the same in Jesus' day. We know the names of the richest people in the world, right? Do we know the names of the poorest people in the world? No. Even when we see them in the newspaper and magazines or on websites, they're often unnamed. We see a picture of people that are living in poverty, but we never get their names. Yet Jesus does the opposite. He gives dignity to the poor man by naming him, which is one of the reasons that people debate whether this is a parable or not, because, once again, Jesus almost never names someone in a parable. But he leaves the rich man anonymous and gives a name and a dignity to the poor man. So how do we give then, as individuals, how does Jesus want us to give dignity to the poor? Is to get to know them by name. Another way that I think another thing we can learn about Jesus' attitude towards rich and poor in this is how do we see poverty? Do we see poverty as a problem to resolve? Because Jesus says what? The poor will always be among us. Do we see poverty as a solution in the sense that in order for our economic system to work, we've got to have a certain percentage of poor people? So it's actually pretty good that we have a certain amount of poor people because that's how our economy works. Or is Jesus challenging us to look even deeper and to see the poverty, to see the poor as a mirror? See, the poor in our society are a reflection on maybe what's broken about our society, what's not right. It's a reminder that we live in a creation that cries out with pains like childbirth for redemption. The fact that there is poverty in the world, the fact that just this day alone, thousands of people in the world will die literally of poverty is a reminder that there's still much for us to do. It's a reflection on who we are as people. And it's also a reflection on who we are as people that it doesn't bother us enough. And it doesn't bother us enough. It doesn't bother me enough that more could be done to show love, to feed, to give drinks, to clothe the poor among us. And then finally, I think, and maybe most importantly, what Jesus is showing us in this about our own attitudes towards being rich and towards poor is in this whole exchange between the rich man and Abraham. You know, Jesus tells a story and he talks about the rich man ends up in Hades, which is kind of an illustration of hell or punishment. And he goes to Abraham and he tries to start bargaining with Abraham. He says, well, can Lazarus just come quench my thirst? Can you just put, just a little drop of water and I'll be better off? And he's kind of acknowledging that, hey, I'm asking Lazarus to do for me what I wouldn't do for him. Like I wouldn't see that, that rich man could have paid for Lazarus to be healed from his sores. He could have, made sure that he had food. He could have taken care of Lazarus, and he chose not to. But he's saying, hey, well, can Lazarus come comfort me? And kind of acknowledging that he didn't. Then he goes on to say, well, okay, then can he go will you send Lazarus from the dead back to see my brothers? And if my brothers see the poor man that was at my, at the feet of my house or whatever, come back, then surely they'll change their ways. And it is interesting that Jesus uses the name Lazarus to describe the poor man in the story, and then one of Jesus' healing miracles is to bring another Lazarus, who was actually probably a wealthy man, from the dead. So there's both times there's this idea of, Lazarus kind of being this one who could rise from the dead. But the point here is that Abraham's like, no, no, no. And what does he do? He points them back to the scriptures. He says, they have Moses and the prophets to teach them. And the point is this, that no doubt this wealthy man in this story and his brothers, as Jewish people, would have been going to the temple, would have been going to the synagogue weekly and hearing the scrolls, hearing the scriptures read. Hearing things like this from Amos, who says, the end has come upon my people. I will never again past them. The song of the temple shall become wailing in the day, declares the Lord God. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor to the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale, that we make the epith small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with balances, that we may buy poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. The point he's making here is this wealthy man, just from hearing the word of God, should have picked up on the fact that the way we treat the poor matters to God. And one of the reasons that Israel and Judah were ultimately punished was for their idolatry, for a lot of things, but Amos and other prophets said time and time again, God is upset with the way you treat the poor, the injustice done against the poor, and eventually you will be punished for that. And yet, with the poor right in front of him, what does the rich man in this story do? He ignores his help. He ignores his concern. So I want to offer one more question, and if you're not sitting next to someone, look behind you or whatever, but one more question I want you guys to kind of wrestle with. Why do you think it matters how the rich treat the poor? So go ahead and take a couple minutes and wrestle with that, or reflect on that with those around you, either next to you or in the row behind you. Why do you think it matters how the rich treat the poor? Now the band's up here, so we're ready to wrap things up. Let me end with a couple of thoughts here. One, we in America are blessed, truly blessed. We're gonna have the 4th of July here, soon, and one of the things we're blessed with, right, is the pursuit of happiness, right? We have that, and there's a lot of parts of the world, if you've seen, where people don't have that ability. The opportunity to pursue happiness, which pursue wealth, because wealth does bring a certain kind of happiness. A shallow one, but it can. But sometimes maybe one of the lessons from this story today is that, the rich man in this story pursued great happiness. In the end, it left him shallow and empty. So maybe one of the things as followers of Jesus we need is to be, saved from the pursuit of happiness. That we pursue happiness, we make happiness our idol. We make wealth our idol. We make the ability to have whatever we want our idol, and maybe that's part of what we need to be saved from. So my challenge to you then is to give generously, because as wealthy people in the world, we've been given much, and much is expected. So let's close in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We're challenged by this word, but we're also reminded that we don't do any of this. We don't give to the poor. We don't serve others to gain your favor, your love. We already have that. That was won at the cross. And yet Jesus came into this world as a poor man. he lived as a poor person, and he challenges us to consider how we treat the poor matters. So help us to continue to challenge ourselves to give generously to those that are poor, give generously to those that support the poor, and to remember that the poor in our society are a mirror of some of the things that just are broken, that need to be fixed as we wait for you to return. Amen.